Scientific classification. What is classification? Classifying means organizing things into groups. The things in each group have something in common. For example, libraries use a classification system, usually numbers and letters to organize books. Imagine trying to find a book in a library that didn't use a classification system. Scientists use a classification system to organize into groups the many different kinds of organisms, which are living things, found on Earth. Just think of the variety of animals you've seen. Everything from scaly, slithering snakes and snow-white polar bears to brightly colored butterflies and razor-toothed sharks. Plants are also living things, and like animals, they come in many different colors, shapes, and sizes, from towering trees to flowering garden plants, and the many different crops that farmers grow. There are even organisms that are not plants or animals, such as bacteria and mushrooms. Scientists have found ways to classify them too. How does scientific classification work? Scientists divide all things into groups called kingdoms. Then the kingdoms are divided into smaller groups, and those groups are divided into even smaller groups, and so on. As you move from larger to smaller groups, the organisms in each group have more in common. Scientific classification. Kingdoms, 5 groups that contain all living things. Phyla, each kingdom is divided into smaller groups called phyla. Classes, each phylum is divided into smaller groups called classes. Orders, each class is divided into smaller groups called orders. Families, each order is divided into smaller groups called families. Genera, each family is divided into smaller groups called genera. Species, each genus is divided into smaller groups called species. Common and scientific names. We know many living things by their common names, the names people use to refer to them, such as badger. But each organism also has a scientific name made up of its genus and species name. Scientific names come from Latin. Why do organisms need scientific names? Because sometimes common names can be confusing. For example, the animal called a badger in Europe is not the same species that we call a badger in Canada, even though the two look quite similar. The scientific name for the European badger is Meles meles, and the badger found in Canada has the scientific name Taxida taxus. 5 of the kingdoms. Monoran kingdom. Monera are tiny single-celled organisms. Unlike the cells of all other living things, a monoran does not have a nucleus. It's a dark mass at its center. Bacteria and blue-green algae are examples of Monera. There are over 3,000 known species of Monera. The protist kingdom. Protists are single-celled organisms. Protists have a nucleus and other cell parts called organelles. Protists live in water or in damp places. Amoeba is an example of a protist. There are more than 28,000 known species of protist. Fungus kingdom. Fungi are mostly multicellular organisms. They absorb food from other organisms, which may be dead or alive. Molds, mushrooms, and mildew are examples of fungi. There are about 75,000 known species of fungus. Plant kingdom. Plants are multicellular organisms. The cells in a plant contain a green substance called chlorophyll. The cells use chlorophyll to make their own food from water and sunlight. There are more than 400,000 known species of plant. Animal kingdom. Animals are multicellular organisms. Their cells cannot make their own food, so most animals must move around to feed.